Good to see Jerry and Charlene. I had no idea that they would be here, and they surprised me completely yesterday. And appreciate always Dub's introductions, because Dub has pointed out and others have pointed out that I don't need introductions, I just need conclusions. Against all the gods of Egypt. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3, Paul, in writing to the church at Corinth, gives this admonition: "But I fear, lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your mind should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ Jesus." We all know that I had the wrong outline. I need to go to Exodus. I'm always having first when I'm around Brother Dove. I don't know how that happens. In Exodus chapter 12, we have a very good example of the ways in which Satan does work. In Exodus 12, verse 12, "For I will go through the land of Egypt in that night, and will smite all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Jehovah." When we look at these words from the book of Exodus, we realize that God is about to send to Egypt his 10-lesson correspondence course. And it's going to be a very effectual course in the land of Egypt. He is going to do battle with numerous gods of Egypt. In the interest of time, I will be giving a lot of references from the book of Exodus. And when we come to Exodus 7 through Exodus 12, we're going to find many of those plagues really had the desired effect, although it took a lot of time. But I want us to understand what happens here in Exodus chapter 7, verses 8 through 13. This is actually a scene that is an affront to all Egyptians. Moses has come before Pharaoh. He is going to make the request time and time again, coming from Jehovah God, "Let my people go." And in that very first appearance, he comes before Pharaoh. Pharaoh, in all likelihood, is in his official garb. And so on the head of Pharaoh, you will notice what is called the uraeus. This is an enraged cobra, a cobra ready to strike. And it is one of the great gods of Egypt. And Pharaoh himself is counted as deity. Moses casts down his rod, and it turns into a serpent. Pharaoh's magicians come upon the scene, and in some manner they cast down their rods, which also become serpents. But the serpent belonging to Moses swallows up those other serpents. And then Moses is able to pick up that serpent with his bare hands, and it turns back into the rod or the staff that he will use throughout the 10 plagues. When Aaron threw that rod down, it was an affront to the power of Pharaoh, to the deity of Pharaoh. Remember, sitting right on top of his head is that uraeus. And his magicians have their own form of sorcery, but their snakes are consumed. You see, those gods of Egypt were hopeless, helpless, and hapless before Jehovah God. So very quickly, let's look at at all of the plagues that came upon Egypt. The first plague being the water of the Nile River is turned into blood. This is recorded in Exodus chapter 7, verses 14 through 24. The Nile River was quite literally the life's blood of the land of Egypt. Everything that they depended on as far as survival was concerned was because of the Nile River and the way in which it blessed that land of Egypt. The spirit of the Nile was called Happy and took the form of a crocodile when it was being worshipped. The guardian of the Nile was known as Num. Num, of course, was a ram's head. The goddess of the Nile was called Tauret, and this was in the form of a hippopotamus. You see, the Egyptians could pick out almost any object, whether it be alive or inanimate. They just give it a name, and it became a god, with a lowercase g, by the way. And so we see that the land of Egypt has numerous gods that are in their place to protect Egypt, to protect all the belongings of Egypt. Now, the Nile River is turned to blood. You recall that the Nile River had received Hebrew babies. And, of course, they were given to the god Savak, which was a crocodile-headed god. And many of those babies, no doubt, were eaten by crocodiles. When Aaron waved the rod over those waters of the Nile, and it became blood, not only the Nile River, but the canals and those tributaries that led to it. And not only that, when they went to the water that they had stored in their houses and in their homes, that water also was blood. There is no way that anyone can deny the miraculous element. And, of course, the fish died and they stank, and the water stayed that way for 7 straight days. For 7 days, Egypt suffered with that river because, according to Exodus 7, verse 25, Jehovah had smitten the river. The second plague comes in the form of frogs. And I mean, these frogs covered the entire land of Egypt. All over the place, you would find nothing but frogs. And they had to remember that they had a god. Hecht was his name, and he was in the form of a frog. Egypt worshipped frogs. So everywhere they go, they see these frogs. In Psalm 105, verse 30, the psalmist writes, "Their land swarmed with frogs in the chambers of their king." Psalm 105, verse 30. And can't you just imagine the screams of the Egyptian women? These frogs were in their houses, in their bedchambers, in their kitchens. And the sad thing about all of this is they could not even serve up frog legs, because that was one of their gods. And since they worshiped that god, they could not do any damage to a frog. The goddess Hecht was actually credited with blowing the breath of life into men. It was said that this particular god was the one responsible for life within man. So all children of God understand immediately we're going to have conflict with God after God after God in the land of Egypt in comparison with the one true God. Pharaoh is willing to spend one more night with the frogs. Moses allowed him to determine the time when those frogs would go away, would be no more found in the land of Egypt. He said tomorrow. And I dare say most of the preachers in this room have a sermon outline, and it's called "One More Night with the Frogs." And that's what's going on right here in Exodus 8, verse 10. And note the emphasis on the word tomorrow as you go through this section of the book of Exodus. You're going to find it in Exodus 8, verse 10, then verse 23, then verse 29, and then again at chapter 9, verses 5 and 18, and finally in chapter 10, verse 4. Excuse me. Many times we see the emphasis placed upon that word tomorrow. In Psalm 78:45, the psalmist writes again, "He, that is God, sent among them frogs which destroyed them." Now only the true God of Israel could make those frogs appear at his command and then die at his command. The third plague comes in the form of lice. This takes us to Exodus chapter 8, verses 16 and following. The very dust of Egypt was turned into minute and noxious insects. The lice came from the dust. This was an affront to Geb or Seb, depending on the Egyptian writer that you're reading after. This god has two different names. Thank you so much. No. That would have been fun for Brother Jerry. But Geb or Seb was the earth god. The Hebrew word is kinnim, Kinnim when transliterated. It's been rendered as lice, as gnats, as mosquitoes. In the Septuagint, it is called sandflies. So obviously we cannot be dogmatic. But whatever form or variety it was a noxious and a hateful insect with which to deal. And I want you to notice at this time that we have the first 9 plagues dividing themselves into 3 triplets. In the first and the second plague, Pharaoh is warned. He knows what's coming if he does not let God's people go. But the third plague, Pharaoh has no idea. Egyptians have no idea that it is coming. And then you go to the next group of triplets, and the first 2 plagues, Pharaoh knows about it. He has a choice. He rejects God's threat to him to let his people go. But then the third plague comes in that series, and there's no warning. And the same with the third set of 3 plagues. Twice, Pharaoh knows what is coming. Most of Egypt knows exactly what's right around the bend. But then comes that next plague, and there's no warning that it's coming at all. When the priest of Egypt would appear before Pharaoh, they had to emphasize cleanliness of their bodies. And as they do so, according to Herodotus in his volume Hero, chapter 2, verse 37, quote, "So scrupulous were the priests on this point that they used to shave their heads and bodies every 3rd day for fear of harboring vermin." And that's what we're dealing with, vermin. And Egypt's magicians had attempted to duplicate this particular plague as they done with the others, but this time they were unable to do so. This is the finger of God. They admit this in Exodus chapter 8, verse 19. Now, they are not acknowledging Jehovah as God. They are simply admitting that their gods are actually inferior to the God of the Hebrew people. And they acknowledge that he is then deity, but this deity is in battle with their deities. Plague number 4. Now comes a plague of flies. In Exodus 8, verses 20 through 32, we have the description of this plague given. These are called swarms of flies. Exodus chapter 8, verses 21 and 22. Also note verse 29, then verse 31. Swarms of flies. And Texans and Okies know about swarms of flies. There are those seasons of the year when flies are such a pest. And this time, there is a distinction in where the flies are swarming. They're not swarming in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites are dwelling, but they are in the land of Egypt. Egypt actually had their own Lord of the Flies, and his name was Uatchit, and took the form of a vulture. There is also a god of the air and the wind, and his name is Shu, S-H-U. And I can remember many times when I wondered if my own mother was maybe worshiping the god Shu. It'd be the summertime, and she'd grab that fly swatter, "Shoo fly, shoo fly." And I'm sure that expression was probably heard during that swarm of flies. In Psalm 78:45, God sent among them swarms of flies which devoured them. Now that's what the text says, swarms of flies which devoured them. Egypt had a military medal, and it was known as the Order of the Golden Fly. That Golden Fly Award was given to brave soldiers who had defended Egypt, who had defended Pharaoh in some significant way to be recognized. And I've often wondered again, how many men having that particular award, the Order of the Golden Fly, thought about throwing it in the trash after this particular plague. And in Exodus 8:32, we learn that Pharaoh hardened his heart once again. Neither would he let the people go. As we come to that fifth plague, we come to the murrain, or the pestilence, upon the cattle of Egypt. Exodus chapter 9, 1 through 7. The word murrain is translated with the word pestilence 47 times in the King James Version of the Bible. It is from a Hebrew word, deber, and that word is usually rendered in such a way that it's a very vague term describing some sort of a very widespread epidemic. They had an epidemic with this murrain, or this pestilence, among the cattle of Egypt. Also, the goddess of the desert, who is Hathor, depicted sometimes as a bull, sometimes will be depicted as a cow, was highly honored in Egypt. And again, we have to ask, where are these gods of Egypt in the form of a bull, in the form of a cow, when it is the cattle that are being affected? And also, it was none of the Israelite cattle were being affected by this particular plague. The distinction between the plagues is, again, proof positive for the existence of Jehovah God, the reality of Jehovah God, and attest to the fact that he is God. It may have been in the form of anthrax. Some commentaries will suggest that, but you cannot be dogmatic. We just simply do not have enough information to be dogmatic. And also we need to notice a stipulation that it comes to the cattle which are in the field, according to Exodus 9, verse 3. And the livestock was not limited to cattle. According to the text, it includes horses, asses, camels, sheep. So imagine the effect that this had upon the economy of Egypt, with all these various animals being affected. And Moses informed Pharaoh that this disease would come tomorrow. One day the cattle are fine. The next day, this pestilence of murrain came upon the cattle of Egypt. Exodus 9, verse 5. But the heart of Pharaoh remains hardened. He will not give in. He will not yield in any way. He would not let Israel go free. Plague number 6. Here come the boils and the blains of men and beast. This is recorded in Exodus chapter 9, verses 8 through 12. The Egyptians worshipped an idol who is known as Typhon. Typhon, sometimes it would be a man in a costume, and many of the times it would simply be a red bull. In other words, a man would dress in a costume of a red bull, and he was supposed to be this god by the name of Typhon. Typhon. In the offerings that were given to Typhon, sometimes they were human sacrifices. Most of the time they would be a bull, a red bull, which is very powerful symbol of the god of Egypt. And as a sacrifice, bodies of men or of red bulls would be offered. And the ashes were kept. And at a certain time, they would take the particles of those ashes, throw them up into the air, and the people who had gathered for that particular sacrifice on that day had the belief that if some of the ashes, just a few of the ashes, fell upon their body would be protected from all health issues, all diseases, that virtually nothing could affect them in that way. And Moses and Aaron appear to have used those very ashes. And when they throw those ashes up into the air, they come down to bring boils and blains on man and beast. And that plague goes throughout all the land of Egypt, and they use those ashes, and it was an affront again to the god Imhotep in the form of a serpent, and Serapis also in the form of a serpent. And these were their gods of healing. Where are these gods of healing when the men and the women of Egypt are covered with these boils and these blains? And today you can look at the insignia on medical institutions, or look at their doctor's calling card the next time. In all likelihood, you're going to see a pole with a serpent wrapped around it, because the background comes from Egypt, and these are their gods of healing. Sekhmet takes the form of a scorpion, and she was the goddess of epidemics. In other words, anytime an epidemic came upon Egypt, this was the god that you would pray to have healing for that epidemic. So they have an epidemic now that has actually prevented Pharaoh's magicians from being able to come into the presence of Pharaoh. As a rule, those physicians and those magicians would come before Pharaoh on a daily basis. Now, the Hebrew term that is used here is a difficult one. It refers to a very wide variety of skin inflammation. Again, you can read commentaries and see some of the ideas put forth. We can't be dogmatic. But whatever it was, it caused great pain. It caused a lot of suffering. And in this suffering, it many times caused death. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 27 through 35. The false gods of Egypt, like many modern day, they call themselves faith healers. I call them fake healers. Those magicians and those doctors in Egypt could not heal chapped lips. They had actually no ability to fight what was going on in the people of Egypt. And when you look at that word stand in verse 11, it comes from a Hebrew term, amod. That word has been defined in meaning, quote, to be present, to endure, to withstand. And yet, on this occasion, they could not endure. They could not stand. They could not come into the presence of Pharaoh, even though it was fully expected of them. Plague number 7 brings us to the plague of thunder, hail, and fire. In Exodus 9, verses 13 through 35, Egypt had a sky goddess, and her name was Nut. You can make whatever you want of that, but that's what she was called. And Nut was the sky. The Egyptians worshiped the sky. They worshiped the sun. They worshiped the moon. They worshiped the stars. But sky in particular, along with Isis and Seth, who were also the protectors of Egypt's crop. These are some of the gods of Egypt that should have prevented the damage that was done to the crops. But look at the damage. Men and beasts were killed. Plants and vines were destroyed. Trees were broken into pieces. All of this is taking place because of the great power of Jehovah God. Listen to the psalmist in Psalm 105. Let's begin at verse 32. He gave them hail for rain and flaming fire in their land. He smote their vines also and their fig trees, and brake the trees of their border. This was an immense plague that really was going to hurt Egypt, again, from an economical standpoint. He killed their vines with hail and their sycamore trees with frost. Some translations will have great hailstones there. He gave over their cattle also to the hail and their flocks to hot thunderbolts. Psalm 78, verses 47 and 48. Egypt had never seen anything like this before. We are told that in Exodus 9, verse 24. The flax and the barley were smitten, according to Exodus 9 and the verses 31. Now, flax was very needful in the land of Egypt. It was the flax that enabled them to form linen for clothing. And in the preparation of mummies, which were done by the hundreds and the hundreds and the hundreds, year in and year out, they would need that. linen was very necessary. It was essential to the preparation of those mummies. And then it says in the next verse, look at Exodus 9:32, the wheat and spelt were not smitten. Spelt is a type of very coarse wheat. It does not have the more delicious taste of actual wheat, but it is a coarse type that could be used in the making of bread. Now, the distinction in the destruction shows God's mercy upon Egypt. Although they had lost their wheat and their spelt, the wheat and the spelt were not smitten. Spelt would allow them to eat. Otherwise, Egypt could have quite literally many citizens starved to death. Also, I want us to notice that God does show this mercy, perhaps in an effort to get Pharaoh to see that God can be good. But Pharaoh would not admit to that. He would not let God's people go. Plague number 8. Now it's time for the locusts to make their appearance. This is recorded in the 10th chapter of Exodus, beginning, in verse 1. I was listening to the late Brother Marshall Keeble in a tent meeting in Lawton, Oklahoma years ago. I was a teenager, and he was in the Gospel of John. I think it was the 3rd chapter, and he came to a verse from John chapter 3 that he had just quoted, and then he said, now, brethren, you're going to find those words in John chapter 3, and he paused. John chapter 3, he said it a couple more times, and it was obvious that, like myself and some other preachers, it had just left him for the time being. And he said, brethren, just keep on reading and you'll run into it. And so you can just keep on reading and you'll run into it. But that's where you read about the locust. The vegetation that had not been lost to the previous storm was now offered up to a terrible destroyer, locust. A swarm of locusts. I want us to notice that some of the crops from Exodus 9, verses 31 and following, were now mature enough to be bringing forth their foliage again. But now come the locust, and locusts are unmerciful. In Serapis, another god of Egypt in the form of a serpent, he was counted in Egypt as a god of healing, and also had double duty. He was to protect the crops of the land of Egypt. Isis and Seth, other gods of Egypt, were also responsible for protecting the crops of Egypt. Neprab is counted as the god of all the grain in Egypt. Egypt's crop loss from this plague was 100%. The Lord God of heaven had attacked the crops of Egypt. Egyptians had never seen this many locusts before, not in their entire lives. That's pointed out by the writer Moses in Exodus 10, verses 5 and 6, and then notice verses 14 and 15. And the terms grasshoppers and locust are sometimes interchangeable in the English language, and it looks that way in the Hebrew as well. In the Hebrew, we have the word arbeh, and it's sometimes used interchangeably, just as we do today. I want us to notice that the word arbeh can also be used to refer to a plague, just a general plague. In Deuteronomy 28, verse 38, in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 37, and 2 Chronicles 6, verse 28. And so we have many instances where this word is used as a plague, and sometimes the identifying factor of that plague, which could be grasshoppers or locust. I want us to notice that only the hopping locusts or insects were counted as clean food. This goes back to the law of Moses in Leviticus chapter 11, beginning in verse 20 and following. And you recall that John the Immerser himself ate locust and wild honey. and that's according to Matthew 3, verse 4, and Mark chapter 1, verse 6. So it is a clean food for the Hebrew people. But a plague of locusts is unstoppable. There are those who have actually realized that a locust invasion is on its way and have tried water. But when you drown enough locusts, then the remaining locusts will use their bodies to walk across to their destination. Sometimes ranchers and farmers have tried to use fire. We'll just burn them out, and the locust can actually smother that flame. You have a lot of dead locusts, but the locusts that remain will just use their bodies again as a bridge. They are virtually unstoppable in that regard. And according to the text, Jehovah is the one who sent the east wind to bring those locusts. Exodus chapter 10, verse 13. Compare that with also Exodus 14, verse 21. And when the deed was done, when everything was finished, Moses entreated Jehovah. And the Lord God this time turned an exceeding strong west wind, not an east wind, a west wind which took up the locusts and drove them into the Red Sea. There remained not one locust in all the border of Egypt. Now, when I read Exodus 10, verse 19, a thought comes to my mind. If you've ever been around a locust plague and you somehow are able to kill them out, how many times after that killing of them out will you not be able to find a single solitary locust? But the text says very clearly, there remained not one locust in all the border of Egypt. Only my God could perform such a task. They're described as winged creeping things that go upon all fours, which have legs above their feet, wherewith to leap upon the earth, according to Leviticus 11, verses 21 and following. The ninth plague was a darkness that lasted for 3 days, as we learn in Exodus 10, 21 through 29. Ra, the god of the sun, he was probably one of the most popular gods in the land of Egypt, beyond Pharaoh himself. And Atum, in the form of a serpent, was revered as being a sun god. Then we also have Horus in the form of a hawk. Sometimes he will be pictured as a falcon. And if you're ever able to come across a picture or a representation of Horus, look carefully at the eyes of that hawk or that falcon. The right eye is in the form of the sun. The left eye is in the form of the moon. Egyptians worshiped the sun and the moon. And here are these sun gods. They even had a god of the sunset by the name of Tim. So many sun gods. And for 3 straight hours, for 3 straight days, 72 hours, there's no sunrise, there's no sunset, there's no sunlight, there's no moonlight, there's no starlight. It is the sky god Horus who should have been taking care of Egypt. He should have brought forth the sun and the moon and the stars. But there was simply no light. There remained a darkness over the land of Egypt, which may be felt. Exodus 10, verse 21. On 3 separate occasions, I have gone down into Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. Many of you may have done the very same, or perhaps another set of caverns somewhere in the United States. And you get down about a quarter of a mile, I guess, into the heart of the earth, and the tour guide will say, "We're going to kill the lights now. Sit down and don't move." And you say, okay, you aren't sure, but anyway, they turn out the lights, and that's a darkness that may be felt. It was so dark. That word felt is mashah in the Hebrew. It means to feel of, or by implication, to grope. And when you're in one of those caverns and they turn out the lights, you don't want to move because you've just seen all those vast crevices just beyond, and you would surely fall to your death if you tried to walk around in that. So you don't move. That's what happens. Look at Exodus 10:23. The thickness of that darkness was so intense that the scripture says, they saw not one another, neither rose anyone from his place for 3 days. Imagine all the lights are turned out, and you can't move out of your pews for 3 days. You don't dare to move for 3 days. That's what was going on. The sun gods of Egypt were myriad, but they were simply unable to compete with the Lord God of heaven. The 10th plague, the final plague. The death of the firstborn comes to Egypt, Exodus 11, verses 4 through 8, Exodus 12, verses 29 through 36, and Jehovah smote all the firstborn of Egypt, Psalm 78:51. Hecht, the frog god, was a goddess of birth. Selket, and this is the form of a scorpion, was the guardian of life for all of Egypt. And of course, Pharaoh's own son dies, his firstborn son, Exodus 11, verse 5. Now, Pharaoh and the family of Pharaoh were protected by some very special gods that were not made available, apparently, to all Egyptians, but only for Pharaoh's family. Sed in the form of a jackal, Renuad in the form of the cobra, and Meshkanet presided at childbirth for all the Egyptian women. And Pharaoh's family was not protected. No family in Egypt was protected. The Israelites, of course, were given the instructions for the Passover, and we will not have time for that discussion this morning. But Exodus 11 begins with these words. Jehovah said unto Moses, yet one plague more will I bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterwards he will let you go hence. Exodus 11, verse 1. Now that word plague in the Hebrew speaks literally of a stroke or a massive blow. And Egyptians would all admit that they had received a massive blow from Jehovah God. And God, as a loving, protective father, was not going to allow his son to continue in this captivity. Now let's back up all the way to Exodus 4, and the lesson is yours. Thus saith Jehovah, Israel is my son, my firstborn. And I have said unto thee, and this is Pharaoh, I have said unto thee, let my son go. Exodus 4, verses 22 and 23. He is not speaking of Jesus Christ, his only begotten son. He's talking about the land of Israel, the people of Israel. Let my people go. God's 10-lesson Bible correspondence course is over. He has done battle with all the gods of Egypt, and all the gods of Egypt have gone down in total defeat. Jethro said, now I know that Jehovah is greater than all gods. Exodus 18, verse 11. And look at Numbers 33, verse 4, and we close. While the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom Jehovah had smitten upon them, upon their gods also Jehovah executed judgments. I execute judgments, Exodus 12, verse 12. And now in Numbers 33, verse 4, upon their gods, Jehovah executed his judgments. It's a wonderful thing to know the power of the God that we serve. Thank you for your kind time and attention this morning.